and problems which might arise from the use of firearms by French security forces. Despite criticism from French and UN rights experts, the government is seeking to change the constitution to make it easier for emergency powers to be imposed and protect them from legal challenges. Parliament will vote on renewing the state of emergency on the 3rd of February. The EU police agency Europol says the Islamic State group has honed the ability to launch global attacks and is planning to focus more on Europe following the Paris massacre. Europol's chief Rob Wainwright was speaking at the European Union as the European Union opened its new counter-terrorism centre in The Hague. Wainwright said Europol would be able to improve the sharing of information among member states.
Unique also to Europol is the ability to identify links between terrorism and criminal sectors, criminal activity. We know that many of the terrorist suspects, such as those responsible for the terrible attacks in Paris, have a criminal background, are linked with the drug sector, firearms, and other criminal sectors.
Peace talks between the warring parties in Syria, scheduled to open today, will instead begin in Geneva on Friday and last for 6 months, according to the UN Syrian envoy. Staffan de Mistura told reporters that the start date was pushed back because of a stalemate over the makeup of the delegations. Invitations to the participants were expected to be sent out tomorrow. Securing a ceasefire and space to deliver humanitarian aid to suffering Syrians will be among the first priorities, he said. In Egypt, there's a heavy army and police presence in a number of cities to prevent protests on the 5th anniversary of the revolt, which toppled President Hosni Mubarak. Security is particularly tight in Cairo's Tahrir Square, which was the centre of the uprising. Over the last few days, thousands of homes in the capital have been raided as the authorities look for people who might be planning to take to the streets. President Hassan Rouhani has arrived in Rome for the first state visit to Europe by an Iranian leader for the last 16 years. He's expected to sign a contract worth around $2 billion with the steel company Danieli. He's also due to meet Pope Francis. Hundreds of police have staged a protest outside Tunisia's presidential palace to demand a pay rise. The demonstration was organised after the failure of negotiations with the government on salary increases, said a spokesman for Tunisia's Domestic Security Services Union. The police officers' union say that wages have not kept up with inflation. It's 6 minutes past the hour. Alison Hurd will be back on the half hour with more news headlines. Egyptians are today marking the 5th anniversary of the uprising that toppled longtime President Hosni Mubarak. On January 25th, 2011, protesters in Cairo's Tahrir Square began 18 days of popular revolt, a move that also ushered in 5 years of political unrest, the results of which are still visible today. From Cairo, correspondent Ruth Michelson filed this report.
The 25th of January is Egypt's Police Day, designed to celebrate the achievements of the police force. But from 2011, protests organised on this day to showcase police brutality kick-started Egypt's revolution. Anger towards the police had become symbolic for the citizens' hatred of Mubarak's regime, seen as corrupt and repressive. This anger spilled into 18 days of protest, demanding bread, freedom and democracy. Filmmaker Mohammed Hamouda was in Tahrir Square in 2011.
It was a really exciting time, and the future seemed really uncertain, but optimistic.
But the revolution also kick-started years of political turmoil, with Egypt returning to a military-backed government under Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in 2016. Sisi is praised for bringing stability to Egypt, but many say the stability comes at the cost of civil liberties and human rights. The number of opposition figures and journalists jailed in the country has reached an all-time high, including many of those who filled Tahrir Square in 2011.
A lot of the people that were hoping for something, fighting for something at the beginning of 2011, I don't think a lot of them are, I think many of them are very sad about how things are now.
In the days leading up to the 5-year anniversary of the revolution, Egyptian security forces raided over 5,000 homes. Despite protests being effectively banned, there have been some limited calls to go into the streets. These are expected to be met with extreme force. Ruth Michelson, RFI, Cairo.
Well, security has been tightened in Cairo today, and the government of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has warned that demonstrations will not be tolerated. Police have been deployed on the streets, including near Tahrir Square, to head off potential protests. Well, Ruth Michelson now joins us live on the line from Cairo. Ruth, Tahrir Square obviously was at the heart of the Egyptian revolution. What's it looking like today?
Well, rather pathetically, when I was there about an hour ago, it was absolutely pouring with rain, which is quite unusual in Cairo. And there was a kind of a smallish crowd of very, very pro-Sisi demonstrators surrounded by a huge security presence, including armoured personnel carriers and lines of internal security forces. And the protesters who'd been allowed into the square were there to praise the police. They were giving them chocolates and roses, which is very different from the anti-police protests that kicked off the revolution in 2011. And what's really significant about this is that the people who were allowed into the square to protest are exactly, those kinds of pro-government people, and certainly nobody who might oppose the government has been allowed to get anywhere near Tahrir or many of the streets today.
So it might be raining on their parade, but there have been calls to protest by opposition factions, notably the Muslim Brotherhood and the extremist football fans, the Ultras. Is there any evidence of this at all visible on the streets?
Well, the Brotherhood released a list of protest sites this morning. This was about 35 different locations across Cairo and Giza. And so far, there's really been very few indications that these protests have actually taken place at all. It could be that people will come out into the street as we get further into the evening, but it's not really clear how much support the Brotherhood can muster at this point in time. There were also several Facebook pages that had organised protests for today, and one of which, back in December, before it was shut down, had over 50,000 people who had pledged to attend. But again, it could also be that this recent security crackdown and the huge number of apartments raided across the country have been effective in scaring people away from the streets.
Now, Ruth, this is obviously a symbolic anniversary, being 5 years. How does it compare to previous years?
Well, certainly in previous years, we did see larger protests on the street, not of the same magnitude that you'd seen in 2011, but there was some turnout. And unfortunately, this resulted in quite high casualties. So, for example, in 2014, 29 people were killed, 176 people were injured, and 450 people were arrested. And so what it seems like is that the government this year, perhaps because of the significance of the anniversary, decided to try a new tactic. And rather than waiting for people to come into the streets and forcefully suppress these protests, although the security is very much there to do that today, instead they raided apartments and arrested people suspected of organising on social media in advance of the 25th.
We'll leave it there. Correspondent Ruth Michelson on the line from Cairo. It's just gone 12 minutes past the hour. You're listening to Paris Live PM on Radio France International. In Luanda, the trial has resumed of 17 activists accused of plotting to overthrow President José Eduardo dos Santos, Africa's second longest-serving leader. But many say that all these young people were doing was reading a book about democracy. Well, RFI's Brenna Deldorf has been following this trial in Angola, and she's here to tell us more about it. Brenna, can you give us some background on this? Who are these young activists?
Yeah, these young Angolans were inspired by the Arab Spring, and they started holding peaceful protests against the Angolan government back in 2011. I saw footage of a few of these protests, and they would literally last about 5 minutes before security forces shut them down. Many of these activists have been in prison before and faced police brutality. So last June, some of these young activists were meeting to discuss a book about democracy when security forces came and arrested them. The state accused them of plotting a coup. These are very serious charges, but the Angolan public just didn't buy them. You see, these young men are teachers and musicians. They aren't government officials. They don't have much power, and there's no evidence that they had weapons. I talked to Monica Almeida. She's the wife of Luati Berau, one of the activists on trial, and she told me about the charges that she finds ludicrous.
How is it possible in a country that spends a lot of money in security? How can they make a rebellion with 15 young men without guns and without money, without anybody on inside of the regime or inside of the security? It's impossible.
So, Brenna, these activists were held in prison for a long time, and then they were suddenly released. Why is this?
That's right. So 15 of these activists were held in prison for almost 6 months, which was an ordeal for them and their families. Some of them went on hunger strike, and one prisoner actually tried to commit suicide. Their trial began in November, and then in mid-December they were finally released on house arrest. Here's the thing. The Angolan government is in a tough spot right now. There's an economic crisis going on, and people are really starting to criticize the government. Many people believe that they lost even more face by imprisoning these young people who are widely perceived as harmless. Monica Almeida, the wife of one of the activists who we just heard from, said that she thought that the government really released the prisoners just as a way to save face.
And we are living now in an economic crisis in Angola, and the situation is very bad. And we are near of the new elections. People are very unhappy. 15 young people arrested, made a lot of noise here, and the public opinion is the people here are with that 15 guys.
She further said that she thought the government was stuck between a rock and a hard place, that they might not want to pursue the trial because of public opinion, but were scared of losing credibility if they didn't.
Okay, so what's expected then at this trial?
Well, David Mendes, who's the lawyer for the trial, said that it was entering a complicated, more political phase. What's actually happening is it's getting kind of absurd. In December, an Angolan lawyer posted a joking list of his nominations for a fake new government on Facebook, and he included some of the on-trial activists in his list. Well, Angolan officials took it seriously and said that they wanted to question all 70 people that he jokingly named. But none of those so-called witnesses showed up to the trial, which was originally set for January 11th, because no one had contacted them. So the trial was pushed back, and just before coming into the studio, I heard from a few sources that the trial may have been postponed again. So everyone I spoke to just said that it's like a very bad joke. But besides these weird twists and turns, Monica told me that she does remain hopeful, and she said that she just can't see the government sending these men back to prison for any longer. It'd just be too unpopular.
Yeah, sounds like it. Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you, Brenna, and do keep us updated on what happens with that trial.
Thanks, Amanda. Will do.
16 minutes past the hour, you're listening to Radio France International. South Sudan has missed a key deadline to create a transitional government after President Salva Kiir increased the number of provinces from 10 to 28. 28 new governors have already been appointed to head the new provinces, and all of them are loyal to Kiir. This move undermines the peace deal the president reached with his rival Riek Machar back in August, which called for a transitional government of national unity based on the existing 10 states. According to a United Nations report, which was issued last week, the ongoing fighting has displaced more than 2 million people, killed thousands, maimed countless people, and also left many traumatized from rape. Jock Madouk Jock is the co-founder of the Sud Institute, a think tank providing analysis on security governance and democracy in South Sudan. He says that the South Sudanese people are more and more frustrated and explains what's really needed today in the country.
The economy is collapsing. The security situation for all the ordinary people all across the country is desperate, and it is depending on the formation of the government of national unity. What is needed is a political environment in which the communities themselves can return to their traditional way through which they have always settled their conflicts and reconcile their community, which they cannot do at the moment while the political disagreements at the top are still active and while the armies of the warring parties have not been integrated. The political settlement at the top is one thing, but the creation of peace within the daily lives of the ordinary people is quite another, and it will take a long time before a political settlement produces a peaceful coexistence with different groups whose relationships have been destroyed by this conflict.
That was Jacques Madout Jacques, co-founder of the Stud Institute, a think tank in South Sudan. That brings us now to the sports news. RFI's Dan and Jay is here. Dan, what have you got for us?
Thank you, Amanda. We take a quick look at the results of the Australian Open. 13th seed Milos Raonic stunned the 2014 champion and 4th seed Wawrinka in 5 sets, 6-4, 6-3, 5-7, 4-6, 6-3 to enter his second consecutive Australian Open quarterfinal. He will now face Frenchman Gael Monfils, who ousted Russia's Andrei Kuznetsov in 4 sets, 7-5, 3-6, 6-3, 7-6. On the women's side, Johanna Konta became the first British woman to reach the Australian Open quarterfinals since 1983 after she beat Ekaterina Makarova. Konta triumphed 4-6, 6-4, 8-6 in the 3-hour-long clash. In other matches, two-time champion Victoria Azarenka beat Barbora Strykova in straight sets to reach the quarterfinals. Azarenka will now face 7th seed Angelique Kerber, who got the better of Annika Beck in straight sets 6-4, 6-0. In athletics, sportswear giant Adidas is reportedly to end its multi-billion-dollar sponsorship of the International Association of Athletics Federation, or the IAF, 4 years early. Adidas is understood to have reached this decision after the World Anti-Doping Agency's Independent Commission Chairman Dick Pound produced a second report earlier this month which revealed that corruption was embedded within the IAF under former President Lamine Diack. Last November, the Commission's first report had detailed claims of state-sponsored doping within Russia. And for some cricket news, former South African one-day and 2020 international cricketer Gulam Bodhi was today banned for 20 years after he admitted charges of attempting